This is a set of war stories that I've got some pretty good detail on. And I call this one Time and Chance because time and chance has a tendency to throw things in our direction that we didn't expect. And one time when I was on my way home from work on a cold day, it was this time of year back then, I saw a couple of women standing by a black Cadillac crossover that was parked in the grass beside the road. So I pulled over to see if I could lend a hand. You know, I was in my uniform since I was on the way home from the college. You know, I had the blue shirt with the patches and all that. And they had a flat tire on the right front. So I opened the hatch on my Explorer, got out the jack and the four-way lug wrench, and went to work changing the tire. Now, I do this kind of thing regularly when I see people beside the road with flats. Of course, sometimes they got a phone up to their ear and all that, and I usually won't bother those people. I'll feel like they got trouble. I mean, they got, not trouble, but they got help coming. But nobody much knows how to change a tire anymore in a lot of places. And rural Alabama is not as dangerous as Detroit or Chicago, so I just pulled over to help these two ladies out. And I was about half done when a wrecker got there, and the wrecker driver watched me finish changing the tire, and he said something about the donut and how it should be installed on the back. Well, I pointed out that this donut on this Cadillac was the same diameter as the regular tire, so the gears in the differential wouldn't suffer for it. And so he and I had some banter back and forth about that. And I heard him tell the women he had been on the other side of the town when he received the call and wished he had been able to get there sooner. And it was about that time that I realized I had accidentally bumped that wrecker guy out of a roadside assistance call. He was with AAA. And I never would have changed the flat if I'd have known he was on the way, because I didn't mean to steal his job. But they didn't say a word about having called anybody, because when I pulled up and I got out in a uniform, you know, the wrecker guy showed up with his wrecker and jeans and a bomber jacket. But I was putting my tools away, and one of these women asked in her British accent if they needed to sign any paperwork, and I says, nah, I'm just on my way home from work. It was one of those moments. But a customer came walking into my office, a couple of days later, and asked if we could put an oil pump on the engine in his Trailblazer. Now, he was an older fellow that had convinced himself that a new engine heart, a new oil pump would silence his noisy engine. And I guess he was getting low oil pressure readings too, if I remember right. And so I spent a lot of time discussing his request, giving him the respect and all. And people can convince themselves that they are, or themselves, I should have said, that they know what's wrong, and that they'll come up with what needs to be done to fix it, and they want you to fix it for them. And so I redirected this guy's thinking, and I convinced him that before we spent the time and the effort fiddling around with the timing chains on there, we'd have to do a lot of stuff to change that oil pump. I said, why don't we do some exploratory surgery and find out whether an oil pump will take care of your problem or not. So I wrote the work order, and we removed the oil pan, and we found slivers of at least one rod bearing in the oil pan sludge, some of which was still clogging the screen, and we pulled the rod caps one at a time until we found out that number 2 had burned out and shed the metal that wound up there. You can see number 2 right there was in terrible shape, and it burned out a rod basically. And we basically told him he was going to need an engine, and we wound up putting an engine in that one, and that was a good thing. Well, that reminds me of another fellow a few years back that was doing some contract work and he came in there he was a guy he didn't work at the college. He was basically doing some work for the college with some contractors that were putting roofs on one of the buildings or something. And he had his little Ranger parked over there in the grass, kind of not very far from the shop. And he came over there and he says, my little Ranger's starting to rattle a little bit, and the oil light came on this morning. And I said, well, your oil screen's likely clogged with sludge, and that's going to need to be cleaned out. And so this character in the parking lot drained the crankcase oil into a big jug and used a little flashlight he had that he carried with him to examine the oil pump screen through the oil plug hole where you drain the oil, and he could see all of that clogging up in there on the oil screen. So he got some kind of aerosol spray and a coat hanger and whatnot, and worked, and he got some oil in a filter, fresh oil in a filter and all, and working through that oil drain plug hole, he cleaned the clogged screen and then did what he could to flush the stuff out of the pan, all by removing the drain plug, and he at least temporarily fixed that Ranger. Saved himself a lot of money, I guess. I don't know how long that lasted, but this guy right here was a player, man. He could do things. Well, Nick was one of my guys at the time, and he told me his truck was losing water and running hot. It had a leaking hose, but he added water and he had driven it until he damaged it to the point that the compression pushes its way into the coolant, and because he had blown gaskets and it was his only ride, and so we pulled the heads off. And if he was fortunate, all he'd need was gaskets. But it turned out he had cracked the head because he got it too hot. It was one of those deals there. So anyway, the college owns a 2005 Dodge Caravan with nearly 200,000 miles on the clock. And that status changed from being driven every day to being driven about once a week. In other words, the vehicle got to the point to where it wasn't being used the same way it had been used. The guy that was using it retired, and it wound up being used as a sort of a spare vehicle. And so a parasitic drain that may have been there the whole time raised its head, and about half the time, whenever a driver would obtain the keys to use the vehicle, the battery would be dead, and we'd get a call. And with the picoscope connected with an inductive clamp, we discovered a significant drain that evaporated when the accessory relay was removed. And when we'd remove that relay, we'd feel it click, like it was staying energized. And the relay was always staying closed, and it wasn't supposed to do that. And it was keeping the radio, the power windows, and all that stuff up and running even after the driver had exited the vehicle. Now, it wouldn't do this every time, but we caught it doing it during our diagnostics. On this vehicle, the front control module energizes the accessory relay, and the module is part of the totally integrated power module, the TIPM, that smart fuse box. Okay, so with the scan tool connected and the problem present, we didn't see any reason why the accessory relay should have been remaining energized. So we were lucky enough to find the right replacement one for $100 at a local salvage yard. We gave them the number, and they said, yeah, we got one of those. And I said, you just really feel lucky, because a lot of times you can't find those parts anywhere. Or if you find one on eBay, you don't know if it's good or not. But this one here came from a local salvage yard, and we popped it on there and took care of that problem. Now, there was a 2005 Freestar. It wasn't overheating, but it was an occasional no crank. You'd go to start it, and it wouldn't start. We found that we could bypass the secondary terminals in the relay socket, and the starter would spin, but there was no juice making it from the ignition switch to the starter relay coil. And you can basically see how that travels down there. And see, there's your starter relay coil. And of course, the starter relay pulled this current down to the starter motor, and that's what spun it over. Well, somewhere, see, the problem could be anywhere in here, but it turned out that we found it right there, and you can see that lousy connector right there and how chalky and dirty all of those connectors were. That was a nasty mess. And so we basically wound up having to get a connector. Now, if you get a connector shell like that, if you go to one of those flip charts like Motorcraft has or like AC Delco has, you can find these connectors, but my goodness, those things are expensive, like $90 a lot of the times. But if you got to have it, you got to have it, and it's a lot cheaper and easier than putting a wire harness on there. You just got to pay attention to make sure you do a good job splicing the wires and soldering them and all that. So, but the theft light wasn't blinking. What led us to this, and there wasn't any related codes, but we did find a problem right here. Now, this Land Rover was a lot of fun. This guy came to us with a 2004 Land Rover that was leaking brake fluid and had a no-blow problem with the AC. In other words, the blower wouldn't work. Blower was dead, and one of my guys did some Googling, as young guys with smartphones do. Seems like half the people that owned a Rover of this generation had a dead blower motor, and nobody seemed to know the root of the concern, but everybody was running overlays. So with a desire to know why, we dug up the schematic, and in the panel, the fuse was good, the power was passing through it. But when we finally found the blower relay, which was difficult, Identifix had the information wherever it was, even though they said it was for a right-hand drive vehicle. See, this particular terminal right here was supposed to be carrying power from the fuse panel to that relay right there, but it wasn't making it because that circuit inside the fuse panel had burned out. And so rather than try to find another fuse panel for a Land Rover, you know, wow, and he'd probably have to get a title loan just to buy a new fuse panel if he, could get one of those. You know how these Land Rovers are. But we actually went in there and we got a one of these. Let me back up there for a second. We got one of those relay. I mean, those little fuse things. See, there's the schematic right there, and this right here was the fuse panel, and we got one of those. And we actually bypassed that going directly from the battery through a fuse, which is a wise way to do it, to that relay. Instead of it being fed from here, we were feeding it through a dedicated fuse that came in through the bulkhead and went to this relay, and then he had blower again, and everything was just fine. And so that blower situation is not that uncommon, though, because blowers pull a heavy load. Back when Ford vans still had glass fuses in the panel under the dash, they develop a problem because the fuse would get hot enough that it would unsolder itself, melt the solder out of the glass fuse, and we wound up having to, Ford had us cut the wires and install a 30 amp circuit breaker in that thing. But in the Land Rover's case, we fixed it with an inline fuse holder. It worked really good, and it looked real good too when we got through with it. Anytime you do a wire harness repair, it's always good to run the wires through loom or even through existing loom if you can, so it looks factory, because every job is a picture of the person that did it. Now, the title vehicle for this article that I had here initially, whenever I first wrote it, was the 2008 Impala that came in on the hook with a report it was making a horrible racket and couldn't be driven. And what we found was the number one spark plug had blown out of its hole. That was the one under the alternator back there. Now, this is one of our company cars, and while I didn't dig into my records when the vehicle first came in, I didn't remember us ever replacing the spark plugs in recent history. It was also sporting a set of replacement wires, which I didn't remember us replacing. We did inspections on these once a month. But the problem was when we tried to install another spark plug in the hole, the plug would tighten down a little bit and then it would pop loose. And I was wondering if there was something wrong with the thread, so I got this scope and I looked down there and I saw that that was not in such bad shape, really. That spark plug hole, could have been a lot worse than it was. And so I said, well, let's just go ahead and run a 14 millimeter 1 1/4 thread tap down there and see if we can clear those threads up and put another spark plug in it. And basically that was something that works out pretty good typically. But when you know you're going to be tapping in a spark plug area, you need to put some, what I did when I had to do it at my dad's Crown Vic, which was, it had aluminum heads out there in the parking lot outside of his apartment. He had a spark plug. Somebody had replaced just that one spark plug for some reason because it was mismatched from all the others, and they didn't tighten it enough, and it slowly screwed itself out until it either that or it bounced until it blew out of there. And I had to put a thread insert in that head, but I didn't have an air compressor out there by his apartment to put air blowing in the throttle bodies. I put air blowing in the throttle body with the blower just pushing the air in there solid. And then I turn the engine over very slowly until I feel air coming out of that spark plug hole. Because when that intake valve opens, air will come out of the spark plug hole. And when that happens, and when you're tightening that down, the filings that are coming off of your tap will blow back out of there instead of falling in the cylinder where they don't need to be. Well, on Dad's car, I says I can't really do that because I don't have an air compressor, so I got some good heavy grease. And I put it on the tap, and I went down. I'd go down in there a little bit and pull it out, wipe the grease off, put new grease on it, and I let the grease trap the shavings, and that worked pretty good. And so it was. They probably didn't screw the plug all the way in. I don't know if that was what the deal was or not. But my take on it was that no matter how or why this happened, we needed to come up with a fix. So we pulled the alternator off, and we ran our 14 millimeter 1 1/4 thread tap down through there. And we put another plug in it, and that was just fine, Now, some of you guys up north have run into this nonsense before. See how this rust-ravaged brake lines and everything on these northern cars? Needed brake work. Scrubbing in the rear. You notice how it had worn all the way down to where the piston was rubbing against the rotor. Well, one of my students made a remark that cars in the south rust from the top down and cars from the north rust from the bottom up. But down on the Texas coast, some of the shops used to regularly spray the underside of cars with oil to protect them from the salty air. I don't know if anybody does that anymore down there. And whenever you left the beach, down at Corpus Christi years ago, when you leave the beach down at Corpus Christi in Texas, they had these special car washes that would wash the underside of your car. That was all it would wash. Water would just splash up on the side of your car and wash any of that salt off or whatever. Well, the left rear inner brake pad was so gone on that, the caliper was kissing the rotor, and you can see that in the photo. If that wasn't enough, the car was blessed with enough rust, particularly on fluid carrying lines, to make it very dangerous to drive. And this was fuel lines, this was brake lines, this was every line on there looked about like this one right here. It's just awful. And, you know, this was a sudden death situation car is what it was. It would have been a matter of time before the brakes failed because of these rusty lines. And it was only by chance his vehicle wound up on our lift before it happened. Well, the brakes got replacement rear rotors, a new left rear caliper, brake lines to the rear. We built it with bulk tubing with that fancy, you know, copper nickel stuff that you buy from the parts store that's really easy to work with. It makes a wonderful brake line. And then double flares, and the leaking fuel line was replaced from stem to stern with a new steel line, but I had to cut an 8 millimeter return pipe off of an old fuel pump. And that's what I did right there. So the plastic quick connect could work back in the tank, you know. So we replaced the rusty fuel filter that looked just about as bad as everything else under there. And that encounter was a victory. But time and chance and entropy had done their best to render that vehicle undrivable. And this has been a short video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next time, and I thank you for listening.